Hello, welcome everyone. I'm going to talk about Martin Buber and the I thou, I it relationship in the frame of interpersonal communication and how we're entering into our conversations. And I'm going to just talk a lot about how to be in the moment, how to slow down a little, and how are we listening and thinking about how our differences make us stronger. So I am going to dive into this topic. Uh, the first thing about Martin Buber and the dialogue is there's a lot of things we could watch, and I put up some links for you to learn about who Martin Buber is and the development of the philosophy of the I thou philosophy. But as we're intersecting it with our interpersonal communication studies this term, I am going to want you to think about what is happening in the conversation, which I sometimes call the dyad. The dyad meaning two people going back and forth. And are we moving from a monologue to a dialogue? Is it monologuing or dialoguing? And how are we participating as a listener and how we are crafting our responses so that we can honor self and the other? What is really happening in that? And Martin Buber gave us a really good navigation tool to think about that. So in when we think about that conversation or any conversation, we want to start to realize that every communication event is unique. It's completely new. It never happened before, and it will not happen again. Each conversation is completely unique, even though we feel like we have the same argument with our kids or with our parents or with our romantic partner. That why do we keep having the same issue come up again and again and again? We do fall into patterns, and those patterns are often the thing that is tethering us to a past expectation, a past experience, a past events that tether becomes a filter for how we're experiencing this moment. And when we allow, although we need that to have some type of ability to enter into our experiences, we need to also let go of those pasts so that we can be mindful of what's happening in this exact moment. Maybe you've had this experience where you were really trying to show up and explain what your perspective was or how you were feeling, and someone started jumping in and completing your sentence or jumping to conclusions and deciding that you meant something other than what you were trying to say, and how frustrating that is. And you're like, that's actually not where I was going. I actually have a completely different point that I'm trying to make. If you let me finish, right? Like we feel like, could you let me finish my entire thought? So that is kind of something we want to think about, that each communication event is unique. We also want to remember, for principles of communication, how unpredictable uh, everything is. Everything is unpredictable. Uh, Even in Groundhog Day. Groundhog Day is a really old movie from 1990s, 89, 90, somewhere in there, that where he has the same day over and over and over again, and he's stuck in this kind of purgatory of the same day. But what the lesson is, one of the lessons of Groundhog Day movie is that he wasn't actually really paying attention to others and his responsibility to others. And he wasn't really reacting to people. He was just deciding who they were and then kind of railroading over the day to serve his own purpose. That the people in his life were ends to his means. They were just characters in his story. And he had to realize that other people had stories and he had to join the story of the people around him. So when we talk about Martin Buber and we talk about the I, it, and I, thou relationship, that's kind of the umbrella of how we want to go about thinking about conversations as an opportunity and how we can ethically show up in those moments. So we have the uniqueness, the unpredictable parts of it, and that we also have different dimensions that we are navigating. We have content dimension. So content dimension is the literal meaning of the messages we're sending. I have something exactly that I want to tell you, and I am trying to use brevity and clarity and preciseness to get you my message, right? I have a literal meaning to my message, the content. Uh, However, this often gets kind of muddled with all the nonverbals that are going on, that sometimes people are mismatched. That's a term. There's a term called being mismatched, meaning your nonverbals are not matching your verbal, literal message. That's the difference between someone saying, "Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah, this is the best day of my life," where there's something where my nonverbals and the tone of my voice don't match the message I'm sending. Uh, Actually, my husband had really good news this morning that he had to tell me, but he said it kind of like with this really bland Monday morning rainy day blues tone to it. And he's like, "Yeah, so it turns out I got the message and da 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 da." And I was like, I had to stop, go, okay, wait. The literal meaning, the content dimension of his message was really good news, but his nonverbals sounded like he was giving me bad news. And I had to like go, "Hey, hun, um, you are mismatched. So I'm not sure what to believe. Is this good news or bad news?" And then he uh over exaggerated his nonverbals for good news for me, which I thought was really funny. It made me laugh a lot. That's what happens when you get married to a communication professor. You get called out when you're mismatching the message. Uh, so that's fine. I mean, that's okay to be mismatched on your message, but we want to be clear about verbals and nonverbals and how those are creating layers to meaning. And if we're unsure, then ask. That's okay to check your perceptions on that. Then we have another layer. There's so many layers. The other layer, of course, is the relationship itself, the relationship and the context of the environment and all the relationship dimension would be the labels of our relationship. Like, are we best friends? Is there a power dynamic? Is this my supervisor? Am I the subordinate? Um, like, is there some power element to the relationship? Is there a marriage? Is it a romantic? Is it the first date? Or are we 3 years into the romantic relationship? Like, all of these things are impacting how we are listening, how we're crafting our messages, and this changes the interpersonal dynamic. So that can become a muddled mess. There's a lot to consider. And when I say slow down the conversation, I'm really asking you to take note of these. And this will help us when we start bringing in Martin Buber's I, it, thou relationship and how we can show up in conversation with more ethical responsibility of that of our piece of the puzzle. The truth is, we only have control over our own choices. We don't have control over the other person. If we are trying to get our message to someone in a way to um, to control their emotional reaction, to control the outcome of the interaction for our purposes. If I need something from you and I am communicating only in a way to control how you react. Like I'm just narrowing and narrowing and narrowing your choice till you only have one choice. That is a type of influence and manipulation that isn't really honoring uh, the other perspective and a chance for a dialogue. We're moving into monologue. It's my story or the highway. It's my way or the highway. It's my story, and you are just merely a character. You are merely a means to my end. And we create, sometimes we limit the other person's choices and the other person's piece in it, and the consequences of that is that we erode trust, and we aren't really in a relationship that has concern for others, right? Now, sometimes if we consciously choose to be in an interaction where we know we'll have narrow choices and we are choosing that purposefully, without manipulation, sometimes we do that because there is some outcome that is greater than self. That gets really complicated. I don't know if I can really touch that in this moment, but that would be something I'd like you to kind of just put a pin in, because we will come to those things too. So, in that, how are we building our communication skills? Let's define Martin Buber's dialogue ethic and the philosophy of dialogue and the I, thou, and the I, it. I think it would be great. We're going to end with I, thou. Let's start with I, it. Um, so Martin Buber says it to represent when the other in an interaction is being used for their own purpose. The it is to kind of create an objectification of the other. And when we put the other the other communicator in this interpersonal interaction in an it place, we are using stereotypes and labels to decide who that person is. And when we use a label on somebody, we're going to, like sticky notes, we're going to stick all these labels on you. With each label comes its own context and baggage and stereotypes, that are layered from experiences of the way that we consume stories, the programming we watch, messaging we get from society, that have defined that label. And then when you're interacting with just one person and you decide they are it, whatever that it label you give to them, whether it's based on race or gender, sexuality, ability, uh, age, whatever it is that you have decided to it the other, that becomes a veil, which we will talk more about the veil from W.E.B. Du Bois coming up in another week. But we create a veil that of stereotypes around that person. And then the expectation going into that conversation is that they fulfill our expectations of that stereotype. And boy, you know, when you're in a conversation where someone is using a label to decide who you are, because you feel like no matter what you say, they are in a completely different conversation. They have an expectation of who you are. They've decided who you are, and they are conversing. And you're like, I'm sorry, are you talking to me? Because if you were talking to me, you would hear me. You wouldn't put that label on me and decide who I am, even or even you would listen to me. Are you even listening? And it creates this kind of fragmentation, right? Like we are looking through, imagine there's a glass and someone broke the glass and it's all cracked and you can't really see through it all in one piece. Like uh, it's all fragmented. That's what it means to be in an I-it relationship. You have been kind of torn to pieces in a way, and there one is someone is dealing with only one slice and not thinking of you as a whole. So it has a superficialness to it. We're using those stereotypes. So a thing about stereotypes is stereotypes are shortcuts. They're shortcuts. I mean, we live in a hectic world. We are full of stimulus, actually more than ever in human history because of these phone devices that we are walking around with, right? And these computers and programming and information. And even the way sometimes that we wear clothes with all the branding on it, we are just bombarded with information. So sometimes our shortcuts are ways that we're trying to maneuver through a world full of information. However, when we do that to a single individual, we are putting them in a category, and the category is based on preconceived notions that are not true for the singularity. And that can be dehumanizing. When we talk to someone or relate to someone based on a stereotype or a preconceived idea, we have taken the humanity out of that person and we have created them as a category, a generalization that we have. We could do that about each other as students and the professor. If I get an email that feels like I am put in the category of the stereotype of professor, that doesn't honor me as an individual, that feels like have I'm being fragmented and I've lost some of the human quality of the experience of getting to interact with others. Um, and you probably have this experience sometimes as a student that you feel like the way the institution of the university or some professors come at you with the stereotype of a student. The knee-jerk reaction to this is often to manage your identity. Hey, like, hey, look at me. This may have happened. That doesn't define me. I may have turned this in late, but that's not who I am. And we end up in these conversations about identity management, and we are feeling defensive, and don't feel like we can trust the other to know us, and we don't feel trusted to be seen. And that comes from years and years of an erosion of being categorized and being used as a shortcut of understanding. So when we are looking at Martin Buber says if you are in a conversation that is like this, you are both monologuing. Nobody is in a dialogue. It's my monologue, my story, my story. And then how are we using the other person to monologue? How are we using, and I put up a cute little comedic scene from Big Bang Theory with Sheldon and Leonard with the chess time clocks, where they each are flooded in an emotional problem. And Leonard seems to be Leonard goes, hey, could it be that we are not in the same conversation? Have you ever felt like you weren't in the same conversation? Each person was just trying to maneuver their own story, and the other person was just there, like as a not as a whole person, but as an it in their story, as an ends to their own story. And that clip that I posted is a really good example. It's, of course, an over exaggeration, but I think in subtle ways, this is happening in a lot of our interactions. So if we're going to talk about ethical communication, we need to understand this I-it thing. So how do we see others? Are we just using shortcuts? Are we just saying I going to our knee-jerk reaction of who that person is? Or are we going to slow down and be mindful and honest? And how are we going to, and I mean honesty in the most, to expand honesty, to be compassionate and kind and straightforward with others, not as that manipulative way that I'm going to truncate information in order to justify uh, my what I want out of this conversation. Some people use honesty as a an excuse to be rude, right? Hey, you can't handle it? I'm just being honest. It's your problem if you can't handle honesty, right? It's kind of exaggerating, but often we hear honesty used as an excuse to be unkind. And that is its own type of manipulation and its own type of influence on making sure the way the other person sees me and relates to me is about me and my own story. And it isn't about how we are thinking about the other person and their story that they're crafting to maneuver. We need to be in a dialogue. So if we have a critique or something to say that might be a moment of friction for the other person, it's how we show up with clarity and compassion. And do you want that person to? We all want, I think most of us, I shouldn't speak for all, but most of us want to know if we need information. I had a dear friend once, and he always says, hey, if someone isn't telling you you're screwing up, you ain't got no friends, right? He has to say that to me. And I was pretty young when I was interacting with him in my 20s, and it was just so, oh yeah, I do want information when I screwed up, but I'm sensitive and I care about others and I want to be a kind person in the world. And sometimes that information, uh, I will go into a sticky place in my head where it's hard for me to be forgiving of myself or kind to myself. And that's my own junk, but at least if someone says, "Yeah, hey, I noticed this," and they're clear and concise, and it comes from a place of kindness, and then I can dialogue about it, that can really help sometimes. I don't know. Just something to think about. So, because this is really difficult and we are mostly being interacted with as if we are in it, we are the it in other people's eye story, we develop layers of armor and barriers to protect ourselves to get through the day. And that detachment, we lose the ability to be whole, we lose the ability to trust, and that disconnectedness, that feeling of rejection, uh, we we have that's an issue, right? That leads to isolation as social anxiety. It can lead to loneliness and otheredness and feeling like we're outsiders in our own groups that we want to be identified with. So that makes us vulnerable to being sucked into really manipulative or situations or being used even more because we've lost our ability to have that more authentic relationship. So let's talk about the I thou relationship that Martin Buber is the foundation of Martin Buber's philosophy. And so this is a conversation with mutuality. It has consent. It has where individuals are encountering an authentic being without barrier. So the word barrier is really without labels, without that veil of a stereotype. It's the expectation that you will see me and I will see you, and I'll be there. And we recognize that the other person is more than just a means to my own end, right? We're trying to dissolve that in the conversation. Ooh, conversations move at rapid speed. Even when they're slow, we get into our own cycle. It's really hard to step out of that and be mindful and think about the well-being of self and others. So, how do we, that I thou relationship is a dialogue. It means you need to find common ground. It means you need to transform the moment and choose not to see the other as an it, but as a whole. And that word I, thou, I, you, that is a genuine mutuality that I will recognize the wholeness of the other. The thou is to recognize the wholeness of the other. Now, that whole person that's before you, it's accepting them as they are. It's not trying to fix them. It's not trying to over advise them. Like some of us have habits. And since I'm a teacher, this is one I feel especially connected to. I don't want to over advise or decide what is best for you. Advice should be asking for and then given. It should never be the knee-jerk reaction because over time it feels like you are not accepting the other person for the wholeness, even if you meant it from a good place where you just want to help them out, you know? But advice should be asked for, especially this is really difficult in relationships with power dynamics or the parent-child relationship, especially when our kids are now teenagers or adults. We really need to navigate that carefully because we can erode the self-esteem of each other if it's in this auto advice or auto accommodating kind of mode. So we have to allow people to be themselves in the I thou relationship. Sometimes that's uncomfortable, but you can find common ground and you can find where the commonality exists. Uh, so my husband and I have two different religions. We are two different political parties. We are very different in our cultural upbringing. And so when we enter into a conversation with love and kindness, we aren't trying to fix each other. We aren't trying to persuade each other. We aren't trying to influence or manipulate each other into seeing it our way. If we have a difference of opinion, we show up in conversation that I am here to hold space for you. And you should not talk to me as if you're trying to convince me, but rather get it back into the I think, I feel, and have more nuance of your experience that you want to share with me. And because I'm in a relationship where a loving relationship where I want to um, show up for the person that my husband as a whole person, if I don't want to fix him. I don't want to change him. I love that he's different than me. And then we find the common ground that we can stand on in our relationship that becomes a foundation for our differences to flourish. One way to think about the I thou relationship is to move people out of 2D into 3D. Maybe even more than 3D into real life, right? Even in 3D, you're still looking at a flat screen, even with all of these beautiful technology advancements of FaceTiming and Zooming. And the truth is, I am still just a flat screen. But if we were in person, the dimensions would add more dimension to me. So that's just like a an analogy to think about conversation. Is your conversation in 2D, 3D, or person to person, right? And this brings me back to what we started with, that when we're in a conversation, because things are moving at a certain speed, we're often looking to reference points of our history. It could be the history of this relationship or a similar, we all of a sudden latch onto something similar that we had a past experience. Oh, I had a past experience with a boss who was I'm not over it, right? I'm not over that past experience with the boss. I have a new boss, and they start moving into a conversation that reminds me that I'm tethered to this past experience. And then I take that and I slap it onto that person and I decide who they are, right? It's a little bit different than a stereotype because I'm using my own history to decide who that person is. Well, maybe they aren't a great boss like that other boss, but the truth is they're a completely different person. And that takes a lot of emotional work to untether yourself from that and show up for this person as a whole person. And then allow that person the uh you have responsibility. In a conversation, you have responsibility to the other to treat them as a unique individual. Even if we are tethered to a past experience that was very difficult, uh, and we are and emotional, and that memory has probably can become calcified in our brains. And it's once we go down that slippery slope, it's hard not to splash down into the emotional experience of the past. And to stay in the present moment takes a lot of practice and it takes a lot of kindness. So sorry to use my husband and I again, but both my husband and I are in our second marriage together. We both come from past marriages. And when we were first together, it was really hard not to slide right down that slippery slope in and splash down into the emotion and start into the script of an it script. And I'm like, I am not your past. I am a totally different person. And if you give me a chance, I can show you I am different. And the same for me. I would have to say, hey, I'm very sensitive around this issue because I'm tethered to an emotional experience where I'm feeling splashed down in something from my past. And I need to figure out how to get into this moment with you and know that this is different. And if you meta communicate these things with your most intimate relationships and people who want to show up for you, and you want to show up for them and help each other through that, that is what mutual I thou is. Mutual respect, responsibility for others, and a true I thou communication event. It's a unique experience. It's completely unpredictable. So we want to be kind to those tethered spirit experiences. They're helping us too to make sure we learn from our past, but we don't want to repeat it. We want to learn mistakes made, lessons learned, and move into a new way of being. But that takes a lot of awareness, a lot of consciousness. And it takes you need that from the other as well. And if that other person doesn't want to participate that in with you, you need to find ways, like it may not be your boss's job to slow down, and your boss is like, I hired you for this. You are an it in this job, and I don't have slow down and help you navigate your emotional tether of the past. I need you to get your job done. So if that can't happen in that, then you need to find those, you need to make sure that you are surrounding people that you can talk to and accept you in the in-person I thou wholeness of who you are. Uh, so you then, because sometimes we just have to get our jobs done. In life, we have a lot of encounters and it's difficult to maneuver. And I'm a sensitive person, and there's a lot of us out there that feel the rockiness of the moment. But even though we have, not but, even though I want to say it differently. In my relationships, in my I thou relationships, where I'm trying to show up, I have responsibility to the other. That is my ethics. My ethics is that when I am responsible to the conversation and I move into dialogue and I listen, then I am living the ethic that is the that honors the means, not just the end, right? So there's a lot to navigate in this, and I hope that you think about conversations in a different way. We're going to keep unraveling this as we move forward, but this is a good way for us to think about how we can add Martin Buber's dialogical I thou into this week. I'm looking forward to your piece of the puzzle as I learn more and we get more into this. Talk to you soon. Bye bye.